Oh, hi. I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, there seems to be a bit of panic in the air. Boy, let's check in with Stacy Herbert, find out more.
Max, as you know, we've had 4 years of a lot of political turmoil, and it's starting to spill out into the streets everywhere you look, not only in the United States, but around the world. And Rand Corporation might have an explanation for this. Now, remember, Rand Corporation, if you're around in the 70s, they were part of the Pentagon Papers, right? It was Daniel Ellsberg released the hundreds of pages of research they had done on the debacle that was the Vietnam War. And now they have basically done some research on the debacle that is Fed policy of creating cantillionaires since 1971. So the top 1% of Americans have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90%, and that's made the U.S. less secure. This is according to Time Magazine's interpretation of the Rand Corporation findings that breaks it down to actual numbers. Everybody has been talking about how inequality is increasing, but they look at the actual data and say, actually, this is how much it is. It's $50 trillion since 1974, right after we went off the gold standard.
Right. Well, there's an explanation of this using financial engineering, and you can get into the minutia of that. But just imagine that there's a pipe that leads from the reservoir to the town, and you've got a bunch of bankers who figured out how to take that pipe and direct it into their pockets, and it never reaches town. So this is the problem. The reservoir being Fed policy, the pipe being economic policy and fiscal policy, and the takeover by the economy by financialization, Wall Street, commodification, and derivatives. The result is just that. The money is diverted through financial engineering, through 0% interest rates, through negative interest rates, through repo scandals, through all the financial scandals we've been covering on this show for 10 years. Every single one of those points to one underlying story. In fact, that Wall Street financial engineers and the kleptocrats divert the money printing into their pockets at a rate that, according to the Rand Corporation, equals more than $50 trillion. So that is your smoking gun. That's why we have social unrest. That's why we have incredible wealth and income gap. That's why we have such a distorted economy. That's why wages are not keeping up. That's why we've got inflation raging. That's your smoking gun. End of story. Thank you. It's been great. Have a great life. No, I'm only kidding.
As I said, the Rand Corporation had revealed through Daniel Ellsberg the sacrifice of all the young people. The then boomers were being sacrificed in the Vietnam War for no reason. And the same here is basically their data showing that Generation Z and the younger millennials have also been sacrificed to this this war on wealth that can't be won. And here's what they say about the actual data. So remember this when you see people, this conflict going on right now between boomers and, they're the winners of this situation. And they call people deplorable for wanting to make America great again. The data actually shows that America was great before. It was better for certain class of people, i.e. the bottom 99%. It wasn't as great for the top 1% back then. This is not some back-of-the-napkin approximation. According to a groundbreaking new working paper by Carter C. Price, Catherine Edwards of the Rand Corporation had the more equitable income distributions of the 3 decades following World War II, 1945 through 1974, merely held steady. The aggregate annual income of Americans earning below the 90th percentile would have been $2.5 trillion higher in the year 2018 alone. This is an amount equal to nearly 12% of GDP, enough to more than double median income, enough to pay every single American in the bottom 9 deciles an additional $1,144 a month, every single year.
See, the genius of the scam perpetrated by Wall Street and the likes of Warren Buffett and the people over at BlackRock and all the private equity firms and JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon and all the global banks is that they take advantage of compound interest in a way that makes them multi-hundred billionaires, because it doesn't take much in terms of a percentage increase to realize extraordinary gains. The difference between compounding your money at, let's say, 0.01%, which is available to the vast majority of those who are not friends of Goldman Sachs, and compounding your money at 20%, as Warren Buffett does, or 22%, is the difference between having, let's say, a few $100 billion or a few $100 million or even a few $1 million to your name, and having, as in the case with Jeff Bezos now, over $200 billion. It's a small percentage gain, but over 10, 20 years. You know, it's the old analogy, if you start off crossing the ocean, if you set your compass even 1 degree difference, you will end up in a very, very, very different place. That's the magic of compound interest. And it's subtle and it's insidious, and most people don't see it, but they do see their poverty. And now we've got the smoking gun. The $50 trillion was stolen from you, and that's it. That's using all the techniques we've been talking about here for 10 years. This is now the conclusion. This is the ultimate Keiser Report stat. This is now everyone, naysayer, and those who have questioned our approach, they can now, I accept your apologies. I accept them.
I guess you might say we're kind of leaking this Rand report. We're the Daniel Ellsbergs of the financial world because nobody else is reporting on this. Okay, this is online in Time magazine, but we're reporting it on the news to explain the situation. We coined that phrase cantillionaire, we being Max, coined that phrase cantillionaire, and this kind of explains it. And I also want to point out that, you know, America used to be great back in the 70s. We had this thing called a mimeograph. And, you know, it was very reliable. It was messy and dirty, but it was reliable. No matter what, like, you get ink all over you, but you could make a copy of a piece of paper. Here, like with all these high-tech gadgets we now have, half the time they don't work. So my printer, I could not get to work. That's why I have my laptop here on the set, unlike usual times. But I'm just saying, like, America used to have great mimeographs. Bring back the mimeograph. But, you know, with that, I have something else to say about this, is that what they're saying when they look at the data from people back in the 70s and compare it to today is even when they're looking at the bottom percentiles, they're, you know, comparing the wages, is they're actually working more hours. They're not even counting that. They're just counting their overall wage in the year. So their wages, the situation is actually worse than the 50 trillion if you count the fact that they're actually having to spend more time working.
How we reported on this without the benefit of the Rand Corporation's multitude of analysts crunching the numbers is by looking at some very obvious anomalies. For example, companies buying back their own stock, like Apple. Okay, something that used to be illegal up until the Reagan years, for obvious reasons. It's immoral, it's unethical, and it's just wildly distorting. We simply, okay, here's now a $2 trillion company. Their stock float has shrunk. They've bought back their own stock. Multiply this times a certain number of S&P 500. There's a few trillion right there of that 50 trillion that's been stolen. You take the Lehman Brothers repo scandal, repo 105 or 405, where they were playing whack-a-mole with regulators in terms of how they were reporting their earnings. That was good for a few $1 billion. Okay, we could say with a great deal of certainty that this is the practice used by the multitude of S&P 500 companies. There's another couple of $1 trillion. So all these scams individually, they're all worth $1 trillion or $2 trillion. And when you add them all up, you end up with $50 trillion. So this number, I think, hews pretty closely to what we've been reporting on for the last 10 years, because every single one of these scams from Wall Street, corporate America, the S&P 500, all the big four accounting firms. What a joke. And here I work at a big four accounting firm, but I didn't see $50 trillion go out the door missing. How could that have happened? How could that have happened, big four accounting firms? All right. Sure.
Well, it's the actual system itself, and Rand Corporation is part of that system, and the system is a fiat-based system, and the Fed can print money only for bankers, and they hand the money to bankers, and and it doesn't trickle down. That's the problem with this fiat system. It creates cantillionaires, and cantillionaires come at the expense of everybody else. And so as the cantillionaires start to compete against each other for how many cantillions they have, you know, they have to take it from the bottom. That doesn't ever trickle down. And also you have a system, the rest of the system, you have an IRS that only prosecutes and goes after people earning under $100,000 a year, because they said just this year that they said they can't go after people who have too much money because they have better lawyers. So it's not worth it for them. They don't get anything back. So like the whole entire fabric of our economy and our financial system, our fiscal system, our government system, our central banking system are all rigged against the bottom 99%. And here it is rigged in favor of the 1%. And I'm going to show you another headline that's been happening. And this detail came out of a September 8th filing from the Fed. So unsanitized, the Fed is overpaying banks and hedge funds for corporate bonds. So the Fed was authorized by Congress, as you know, just recently, the Main Street Lending Program to lend to small and medium-sized enterprises throughout this COVID to keep them in business, right? 99.8% of the funding is left untapped at this point. And why? Well, because the Fed can't deal with stinky peasants, right? They only deal with the banks. And the banks, therefore, have to issue these loans. They have to dispense these loans. So the banks do take on a very, very, very tiny risk. But for the peasants, that's just way too much. Like the small and medium-sized enterprises in this sort of economy, not going to survive, right? So the banks don't even want to take a 1% risk, even though they'll be paid back eventually, no matter what. They could always dump their toxic debts and bad debts to the Fed. They won't lend it. So therefore, the Main Street Lending Program is not being used because nobody wants to help the ordinary person, because they know, as the rulers of the system, that there's no chance ever for these companies to survive or for this to get better without it being resolved in another way by the Generation Z and millennials taking back control. So Americans for Financial Reform ferreted out this information in a criminally undiscussed revelation. The Fed reports its corporate bond purchases and loans under the CARES Act to Congress. The most recent one came out September 8th. If you go to the trade level data for bond purchases, you see this very clearly. There's a par value, a market rate for the bond purchases the Fed is making. It is paying more than par with virtually every purchase. It bought Altria, the Marlboro and Jewel people, bonds at 109.9%. It bought Columbia Pipeline Group at 116.7%. It bought Principal Financial Group at 112%. All but a very few hundreds of purchases totaling tens of billions of dollars are made above par. On average, the price is 107%. So, the money printer they just throw money out there and demand nothing in return. And the Main Street Lending Program, which is funded by the Congress, they won't lend it out because they're not sure if these Joe Bag of Donuts with his little coffee shop is really worth investing in.
Right. The only time you see buyers purchasing items above market price is with in a mafia scam. To launder money.
We've discussed that, yeah.
Yeah, this is money laundering.
Yes.
Essentially, it's a classic money laundering. It conforms to the basics of money laundering. If in a court of law this went to a jury, they would be convicted for money laundering.
And I know we're running over time, but I do want to say that critically, the Fed isn't buying these bonds directly, but on the secondary market. So when they overpay, they're lining the pockets of the investors in corporate bonds like hedge funds and institutional investors like PIMCO. Big banks who handle transactions as the primary dealers in corporate bonds also make out. BlackRock, the asset manager giant that manages these purchases on the behalf of the Fed, is likely getting a taste. Essentially, everyone on Wall Street is getting rich from the Fed overpaying for bonds.
Right. It's money laundering. Yeah, it's like, again, we've been saying it, and it results in $50 trillion of missing money. Okay, take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to part 2 of our interview with Michael Saylor. He's the CEO of MicroStrategy. Recently swapped $425 million dirty fiat money for, 38,250 Bitcoin. Michael, welcome back.
Thanks, Max.
So to follow up on this whole discussion about inflation and what you do with a big cash position and the possibility of gold as an alternative, you said that Bitcoin is harder than gold.
When you think about gold, you realize they're gonna mint 2% more of it or mine 2% more of it under the status quo. If the price of gold goes up, the miners are going to make capital investments, expand their capacity, and mine more. If the price goes way up, they'll expand their capacity, keep mining. When the price goes down, they've got a capital investment. They'll act irrationally and keep mining. So under the best case, you're looking at 2 to 3% inflation of gold. If you look out over 100 years, that means you start with $100 million worth of gold and you end with 10 to $12 million worth of gold. So you're going to lose 90% of your value in gold over 100 years. And if you factor in counterparty risk, the fact that the bank might fail or the government might seize the gold, both of which have happened over the last 100 years, the best case is you lose 90% of your wealth in gold, and the worst case is you lose it all. And so gold is inherently inflationary. Bitcoin's fully diluted Bitcoin counts 21 million, which means that once you understand that, you're not losing anything, and there's nothing else like it. So, you know, my analogy would be, if you had $100 million and you wanted to go 100 years and you put it in fiat currency, best case is you lose 99% of your money, and worst case is you put your money in a country, in a bank that fails, and you lose it all. And it's likely you probably lost it all if you had your money in Germany or Japan or France 100 years ago. If you put your $100 million into gold, you're going to lose 90% of it, best case, maybe lose 95% or all of it. Worst case, you put your money in Bitcoin, you're not losing your money. It's like crossing the Atlantic in a rubber raft with a leak in it. That's fiat. Crossing the Atlantic in a wooden ship. That's gold. Or crossing the Atlantic in a steel-hulled container ship. That's Bitcoin. It's pretty obvious what you would do if you had a choice.
So best case scenario, you're losing 2% purchasing power with gold as it is, and you have the possible or tail risk that huge gold is found, or asteroid is found, or ocean gold mining is discovered, and there is a risk on the outside. With Bitcoin, why not take that purchasing power risk down to zero, effectively, is what you're saying. And so it's harder in that sense than gold. Now, you said recently on Anthony Pompliano's podcast, the Pompcast, our good friend over there, that you mentioned the toxic Bitcoin community actually helped you get on the Bitcoin. Can you talk about this a little bit?
I think they're just always giving you suggestions. If, they'll send me articles, they'll send me insights. If I mention anything, they'll lead you to a better insight into the security of the network, into the technology of the network. I think that if you look at the Bitcoin community, it's a bunch of people all joined together with a common goal, which is to create something that's lasting. Immortal, sovereign Bitcoin. Its value in order to achieve what it is you want to achieve with your life, whatever your values are. If you look at the traditional media, they tend to be just as negative as they are positive. And since everyone has divergent values and divergent portfolios, they're not really working together to accomplish something constructive as much as they're shredding each other or tearing each other down much of the time.
There is a frisson that comes with competition, and it's the survival of the fittest. It's Darwinian. It's everyone trying everything and seeing which one works. On that score, you recently tweeted the chart about Bitcoin dominance being at 93%, not what commonly is quoted as the 62 or 63%, because you're saying, look, we got to strip out everything but the proof of work coins. These other projects are crypto applications. They're not in the same ballpark. You also mentioned a network effect in play for Bitcoin, where once it achieves $100 billion valuation or more, it achieves escape velocity, if you will, and it's the winner, and it's a runaway freight train at that point. So you did look at these other coins, including Ethereum, and the conclusion was no, right?
It's kind of silly to say that Bitcoin is only 60% of the market, because you're throwing in like fiat tokens like Tether or Circle. That's kind of like saying Apple Computer is only 5% of the market because there's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of cash and bonds floating around. Or it's just as silly as saying that Airbnb is 4% of the mobile network market because Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple have mobile apps. Right. I mean, at the end of the day, Ethereum is a different type of application, a different type of network on crypto, and it's totally unsuitable as a store of value. You want a proof of, you want a network where they're committed to proof of work. So if you look at a network committed to proof of work, it's Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV. And of course, the first one's 50 times bigger than the second one. Why would you even consider going to something which is 2% or 1% of the size of the dominant player? And it's more like confusing than anything else. If Tether puts $100 billion of Tether coin on the network, that's not going to have any impact on the dominance of Bitcoin one way or the other. It's transcendental.
The thing about it is this community, but I've been in this community now for almost 10 years. You're the first actual CEO with a whole boardroom full of lawyers and board members to do a lot of due diligence and take all these considerations on board, do the analysis, crunch the numbers, and come up to this conclusion. This is the professionalization suddenly of this industry just became real. And I think we're going to see a lot of the marginal projects kind of fade away to zero. Let me ask you a question purely as a data geek, which sounds like you are, being in the data business. The hash rate of Bitcoin is over 150 quintillion calculations per second. When you look at that number, does it kind of, what does it do to your brain? Because it's the biggest, fastest, meanest network ever. Put that into perspective.
I went to the BTC.com security page, and it showed how the difficulty adjustment had gone up from 1 to 17.3 trillion or something, and it showed the hash rate going to 135, 140 exahash or whatever. I thought it was such a thing of beauty. I had to stop myself from tweeting to everybody, isn't this the most beautiful table you've ever seen in your entire life? I thought they'd think I'm crazy. But, when I look at it, what I think is maybe if we're marketers, we would stop calling it difficulty adjustment and we would just call it security index. And we would say that it's 17 trillion times more secure than it was when we started. And we might divide that security index into the other competing networks. And then people would realize that this thing is 1,000,000 times more secure than the other thing. And that's just extraordinary. And that's what makes this, by the way, that's why I think the Bitcoin community is anti-fragile. The miners are making such investments all the time to make the network better, stronger, faster. It's just it's not a wall of electricity. It's a wall of encrypted electricity because you're running the electricity through the SHA-256 algorithm. And the fact that it's unique, the ASICs are unique, the algorithm is unique, the electricity is monstrous. Those three things together create nearly insurmountable, not insurmountable wall for anybody that might want to screw with it. And I love that. It's beautiful.
So gold is roughly $8 or $9 trillion market cap. Bitcoin is hovering around the 200 billion. Will we see parity between these two? And if it's harder than gold, will it exceed parity?
Max, I thought of about spending half my cash in gold and half my cash in Bitcoin. And then I thought, that's kind of a foolish trade because Bitcoin is going to eat gold as a store of value. Technology is acid. Eventually, if you can dematerialize gold into virtual gold, which is what Bitcoin is, all of the energy in the physical gold is going to drain into the virtual gold. Gold will be like BlackBerry was to Apple Computer. And we used to use it. People talked about it. And you can't find them anywhere except in people's drawers anymore.
Everything you're saying, being in this community myself for 9 years, it echoes so much of the work. And you mentioned Saif Dean Moose's book, The Bitcoin Standard. You've been talking about it. You read it. It had an impact on you. We've known Saif Dean for 15 years. And when the book came out, I was gobsmacked. This is like the Rosetta Stone of this whole industry. It just is so perfect. But if in fact your wave of thinking goes into the CEO suites around the world, that right there is an awful lot of demand for Bitcoin. Now, also you've tweeted recently, and I kind of what you were just saying there about the beauty of the technology and the aesthetic of it, which I think is underrated and not talked about enough. But you also mentioned, and we have about a minute or so, you mentioned I don't know, I'm not going to tongue in cheek or what have you, but it was, you mentioned about this project being alive to some degree. Is that pure metaphorical, or is that just an appreciation of the aesthetic? Go ahead.
It's like a swarm of cyber hornets, and serving the goddess of wisdom, fired up by truth, and getting ever stronger, harder, and faster. And I wasn't being metaphorical. I mean, I could talk about it for hours. We don't have hours. The point is, it's not just harder than gold because it's never going to debase. It's harder than gold because people keep improving the protocol, improving the mining rigs. They keep making it harder and better and faster and stronger every day. Gold's not doing that. And most other software doesn't do that. It is truly anti-fragile.
All right. Michael Saylor, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me, Max.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy. Until next time, bye, y'all.